Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Filter B Natural Processed Brazil from Mock Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Mock, based out of Brussels, Belgium. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel multiple times before. But the main reason for this review is because we've received requests in the past to review more Brazilian coffees. So when I found this at a local coffee shop, it felt like a great opportunity to review one, as Mock has generally performed above expectation in our previous reviews. So we will see how this one turned out. This right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this one was pushing it a little bit at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind. We also went a little bit more fine on this one. Now, roast profile for this coffee. So this one is their filter roast, which typically tends to be on the lighter side of things. And Mock does roast a little lighter than a lot of other coffee roasters. That being said, I don't think that they necessarily went overly light on this one, given that it is a Brazilian coffee. And it didn't necessarily feel that way either. So I feel like most people would most closely align this with a more moderately light in terms of that roast profile. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 18, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and it was classically Brazilian, as you might expect, with a very notable nutty and chocolate base to the cup, followed a bit by some subtle fruits and herbality. Nuttiness is also present in the finish in what was an expectedly clean cup, as natural processed Brazilian coffees do tend to be on the cleaner side of things. Day 20 through the Chemex, and the cup is much more lively this second time around, as it was offering a surprising bit of tropical fruit brightness right at the onset before transitioning into a lot of those classical Brazilian characteristics. A little bit more depth, as there's a less fresh version of mangoes that's very much in line with the listed dried fruit, a slight lingering citrus as well. Nonetheless, a much better second impression. Day 22 through the April brewer, and once again pretty similar results as the Chemex day, as its best right off brew with a bit of the tropical fruit brightness and some nuttiness lingering in the background. It does not necessarily cool down particularly well, as it offers a slightly bitter chocolate with an herbal citric finish, so I didn't necessarily enjoy this brewer for that specific reason, as the finish itself on the cool down was not necessarily ideal. We continue on to day 25, as we opted for the V60 with higher temperatures and a more fine grind, and it was a little bit similar, but I felt that there was better definition to this coffee, so I was in two worlds as to whether or not it was our adjustments or just giving this coffee a little bit more time to rest, as it felt best right off brew, offering a slight bit of an apricot and raisin-like component before transitioning into more of the classical Brazilian characteristics. Brightness a little more pronounced today as well, while the chocolate is also pronounced, more so than the nuttiness, at least right off of brew. So this one was better. We continue on to day 28 through the Chemex, and this yielded some mostly mixed results, as there were a lot more of the nutty components right at the forefront of this one. It also offered a brightness pronounced quite a bit, with the stronger Brazilian characteristics dominating this one. So not necessarily exactly what I was looking for on this one, and we opted to stay with the V60 from that point going forward. As on day 31, we made the same sort of adjustments, and as of this day, it was best right off of brew once again, with the chocolate very well defined before settling into much more of the classic Brazilian characteristics. And this is when I really took note of this coffee being so much better right off brew, as once you let it cool down a little bit, it does become a little bit too stereotypical Brazilian coffee. Right on the forefront, you're getting a nice little mixture of a lot of those tropical components to it, a lot of those listed dried fruits, but plenty of the brightness as well. Some well-defined chocolate, but then from that point going forward, it just transitions into what I would describe as maybe a little bit overly nutty of a cup. As on day 35, we went back through the V60, and once again, there's been a fair bit of consistency, as it has that raisin-like fruit aspect with the classical Brazilian nutty chocolate caramel characteristics. Notable drop-off on the cool down, but it is very nice before that. And on day 38, one more try through the V60, as there's been a fair bit of consistency at this point. Best right off of brew, with those chocolate characteristics really defining it. In addition to that, a slightly bitter honey florality. More of the caramel is also present, but for the most part, it's been a pretty straightforward cup. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Yes, I'm not sure how many people actually drink a lot of Brazilian coffees, but when it comes to these natural processed Brazilian coffees, more often than not, they just act like wash processed coffees in general. So having that level 4 for cleanliness is no surprise whatsoever, as it was fully expected going into it. Unless you're really heavily processing these Brazilian coffees, I'm always surprised if it doesn't at least reach that level 4 in terms of the cleanliness. So right there, that's very much in line with the expectations. Finish, level 4. Yes, but I think a lot of people know that the finish was one that I didn't necessarily enjoy, as the cooldown and then the finish itself did yield so many of those nutty characteristics to it. A lot of this tasting wheel was made with that in mind, as I really tried to get a lot of these characteristics done before the cup really transitioned into much more of those stereotypical Brazilian components. So that being there at that level 4, it's in mind that it does not necessarily offer a lot of the less desirable characteristics for myself. Sweetness, level 4. Okay, this one's gonna be a little generous, but I also understand that this one is sweeter than the average Brazilian coffee that we typically have. So that's why I wanted to give it the credit it deserves. It's going to be on the higher side of level 3 or the lower side of level 4, but I felt that there was just enough sweetness from a lot of the characteristics, the chocolates, the caramel, even a bit of the nuttiness and the fruit components to justify that level 4, even if it did barely reach that mark. Acidity, level 4. And once again, since I was kind of pushing this one a little bit more, I was fully expecting a fair bit more brightness from this cup. And I think one of the things they describe from this coffee is that the acidity is maybe a little bit more balanced, and I could kind of see that, as it's not necessarily overbearing. It's not something that's like a hyper strong Kenyan coffee, but even then there was just a notable amount of brightness right from the onset. Enough to the point where I said, okay, it's a little bit more pronounced in the sweetness, and if at the very least we're going to put the sweetness at a level 4, we need to put the acidity right there too. So maybe that one's also on the lower side of level 4, but it's much more of a true level 4 than the sweetness. Chocolate, level 4, that one's a pretty straightforward one, as it's one of the descriptors I believe that they have on here, but if it's not, then it's the epitome of this coffee. It's got that base to it right from the start, and the most consistent characteristic of this one throughout the entirety of it, so no surprise there. Caramel, level 4. So I would say that this is a little bit more of that kind of candied sense to it, but even then at times I was experiencing near equal amounts of caramel as I was for the chocolate components. So having that there at the level 4, once again, maybe slightly high, but given that this coffee seemed to just offer such few strong characteristics, especially right at the forefront, the caramel being there at that level 4 is maybe a little bit more indicative of a lot of the other things not scoring particularly high. Then we have a bunch of level 3s. We will start with the body level 3. So yeah, medium bodied cup of coffee. I think that one's pretty straightforward. V60, probably a lot of this was fully expected. As I'm thinking on that, I also wonder how this coffee might have been through the AeroPress or an automatic coffee maker. Nonetheless, we continue on to the florality level 3. I think I was a little surprised in the earlier days. I was thinking to myself that this has a subtle, more floral component than I was expecting to it. And then towards the end, I said, there's a little bit more of that kind of bitter honey florality to it that, at the very least, I think it justifies that level 3 mark. So level 3 works for me in that. Continue on to the saltiness level 3. That's going to be the nutty component, and I think it's best, at least for me specifically, if you don't let this coffee cool down to the point where it just becomes super nutty, and that's all you're really tasting from this one. So that's the best spot for that for me. Berry fruit, level 3. I mentioned at times that there's a slight raisin-like attribute to it. And once again, they have a pretty generic listed dried fruit components, but that's one of the things I could see in this one, as it's a little bit more of a kind of darker fruit aspect to it. And I think there's some subtle and nice definition to it. Nonetheless, citrus fruit, a little bit more of a generic citrus, and I think it has to do with the brightness being as high as it is. And then the stone fruit, that's something that I mentioned pretty early on, so it was a little bit more of that kind of mango as opposed to the super sugary or fresh mango, but just a little bit more of a typical mango, we'll say, just a little bit more of a generic mango. So stone fruit also felt good there at that level 3 mark. And honestly, as I'm looking at the tasting wheel, I don't think there's anything else worth discussing. I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Once again, Mock has performed slightly above expectations for the coffee that I had going into it. And it's really funny because the first couple of coffees that we reviewed from them were coffees that did not necessarily sound like my type of coffee. This one right here did also not necessarily sound like my type of coffee. And once again, I'm not going to say that this is something that I was just thoroughly impressed by. I will once again say that not necessarily my thing, and it did a little better than I was expecting for something that wasn't necessarily my thing. Nonetheless, the results were good, as I enjoyed this coffee enough, even if at times I felt like it was a little too straightforward, it was a little too one-dimensional, it wasn't necessarily offering anything specifically unique. And towards the end, especially when I was getting a lot of those super strong Brazilian characteristics, and obviously I wasn't liking it, but it felt like a little bit of a challenge to kind of drink this coffee as soon as possible before it did transition into that and kind of get a lot of the characteristics that I was looking for. As far as Brazilian coffees for me go, I know there are some that we're going to try to review this year. I've had some suggestions for the Terra from Passenger to review that one. And then I'm also going to be looking to see if there's anything really unique, exciting, or interesting in the Brazilian category. As far as this one went, I mean, it was about as straightforward Brazilian coffee as you could imagine. Chocolate, nuts, caramel, a lot of those classic South American characteristics on this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you like those characteristics, I think they skew a lot more on the traditional side of things, a little bit more of that kind of crowd pleaser sort of coffee with a little bit of added extras to it at the forefront. Then this one's a really good fit for you, as it does still offer that lighter profile. In addition to that, you're getting an abundance of the nuttiness, which I know is an appealing prospect to a lot of people that really enjoy Brazilian coffees in general. And I keep hearing these rumors of Brazilian coffees that maybe are a lot more on the fruity side of things, that don't offer that same sort of nutty aspect to them. And I really hope that at some point we can find and review some of those ones. But for people that like their more traditional Brazilian coffees, then this one's a pretty good fit. And I feel like that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Filter B Natural Processed Brazil from Mock Coffee. Thank you for watching.